aspire to having greater influence and having your insights valued at higher levels? Have you ever looked at the list of people on boards of directors and wondered how people get on them and why some people are on several? Have you ever thought about being on a board of directors yourself, but have no idea how to make that happen? If you've ever thought about this or are curious, now that I've asked, you are in the very right place. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, you could be live for future episodes on your favorite social channel. You can get all future episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner, in this case, about a month sooner, by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. This is an exciting book to help you think about designing a team that will work most effectively wherever your folks work and creating the culture that you not only want, but that will get you greater results. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com. And with all of that, wow, we've got all kinds of people commenting with where they are. But before I get to those, let me bring in our guest. Her name is Coco Brown. Here she is. Let me introduce her, make it official. Then we'll get to some of those comments before we go any further. Coco Brown is a nationally recognized expert in shaping the modern boardroom and modern leadership. As a result, she's been asked to become an Insights Council member with the prestigious NASDAQ Center for Board Excellence in 2022. She's been quoted and featured in Bloomberg, Entrepreneur, Forbes, Fortune, Information Week, The Street, The Wall Street Journal, and many others. In 2021, she launched Athena Alliance to accelerate wisdom and advancement in the C-suite and boardrooms. To date, the business has established a network of over 5,000 C-level women, VCs, and CEOs from over 200 companies, and helped over 300 women successfully land board placements. Members and corporate customers come from organizations including Amazon, Autodesk, Bank of America, Intel, Intuit, Microsoft, and more. She herself has served on many boards of directors, and her executive experience includes founding and starting 2 companies and serving as president and COO of a leading tech company. She has attended hundreds of board meetings and served on numerous committees to help in a variety of ways across those organizations. And she is our guest today. Her name is Coco Brown. And Coco, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's see. We've got some people saying hello. Let's see. We've got Michigan and we've got Johannesburg, South Africa, and New Jersey, and Rochester, New York, and more from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Hello, Keith Wills. We've got Nice, France, Toronto, San Diego, Lagos, Nigeria, and more. And we're glad all of you are here, whether you said hello so far or not. So, Coco, I'm so glad you know this. You and I have been trying to put this together for a while. And I will also say that this is the 364th episode, or will be the 364th episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And we have never yet had a conversation about boards of directors, getting on a board. The stuff that we're talking about today, it's a brand new topic for us. And I'm so excited for us to have this conversation.
Great. That's fabulous. By the way, I hail from Pennsylvania originally and spent a lot of time in New Jersey. I have teammates or a teammate in South Africa. So nice
there you
to
go.
Everybody.
It's like old home week for Coco.
Yeah.
So I have a question to get us started. Like, what led you to doing this work? You weren't 10 and say, I'm going to help people get on boards of directors. Like, what led you to doing this work?
Actually, that's really funny that you put it that way, because I didn't realize, of course I realized, but I didn't think about this until maybe a couple of years ago. But one of my very first jobs out of college was board director compensation analysis. And I had no idea I would come so full circle. Yeah, I mean, I did compensation analysis for the bank card services division of Wachovia Bank in Wilmington, Delaware. And then I ended up out here in California, and I was working for an HR consultant who was doing a lot of compensation analysis and development for executive teams and boards. And so no, I wasn't 10. And actually, even when I was 22, I wasn't quite realizing that I was going to do that. But it's it's a long winding road, and I think the moment that I realized that I was going to be spending a lot of time thinking about the realm of the board and how one achieves that goal was really in 2015 when Senator Mark Warner was out doing a Hearts and Minds of Silicon Valley tour. He's Democrat, Virginia,
Mhm.
and he was, out here thinking, I think, about a presidential run and meeting with different constituents. And so he wanted to meet with senior women leaders of Silicon Valley, and I was invited to join this discussion of about 20 of us, and 2025 sat around the table with the senator, and someone said boardroom, and then that was it. That was the entire conversation with the senator, was all boardroom. And I got a flurry of emails the next day saying, "That's it, Coco. You've been trying to figure out what your next company is." I have had and continue to have my finger on the pulse of who are the female leaders in Silicon Valley, and now more broadly in the world. And so it became kind of a mandate from an ecosystem that I had already been cultivating to go figure that out. So it wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't something that I gravitated entirely to on my own, although there is an origin story beyond that.
Well, yeah, and it's a good origin story. It's one of the reasons I wanted to share and learn what that would be. So, as I said, we've not talked about boards of directors here necessarily. And I think that in my open, I sort of raised the point like people may wonder, how does it happen? Why does it happen? How might you prepare yourself for it? We'll talk about some of those things, but I thought we'd start with, and by the way, for all of you that are, those of you that are with us live, if you've got questions, feel free to ask those as we go uh, along the way. So I think I thought we'd start with myths. Like, what are the myths about being on a board? Or what are the myths about how they get selected? Like anything, what
Mm.
comes to your mind when I say, what are the biggest myths about being on boards of directors?
Well, I think maybe this is sort of an interesting question. I think a lot of the things that people say about being on a board of directors is true, about how you get there, about how closed the system is, about how much you have to be in the know and in the right ecosystems and know the right people, and that the stars have to align and all of that. Those things are all true. Actually, I wish I could say there were myths, but most everything you hear is true. I would say one myth that sort of perpetuates out there is sort of like anyone can be on a board. I think that's not true. You need to have been properly ready. You have to have spent time in senior leadership, and you have to know what it means to run the business holistically. I think it isn't true that just because you're smart, you should be on a board. And I think sometimes that perpetuates in an odd way. um, it's also a complete myth that there aren't enough women or underrepresented people to serve on boards. That's a complete myth. If just for numbers alone, we're only talking about 30,000 in the US, 30,000 companies that require independent board directors. So there's certainly enough very well qualified, underrepresented anyone to serve on boards that have the right qualifications. So that's a huge myth.
So we can certainly talk today about those seats on boards at those 30,000 companies. And yet I'm confident, and tell me if I'm wrong, that many of the things that we can talk about today would apply to being on a local not-for-profit board or other sorts of things where we could get the chance to have a, a, a different sort of impact or influence, right?
Yeah.
Would that be a fair statement as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I will say, to Johnny's point here, it is a myth that you have to have finance background to be on a board. There's definitely you need to have a certain number of people who are financial experts on public company boards, but that doesn't apply to private company boards, ESOPs, family run offices. But also increasingly you're seeing a push towards other kinds of requirements, like cyber risk and technological expertise, or sustainability risk expertise in general. these aren't required, but people are starting to get more diverse in the thinking about the kinds of skill sets that
They
need to.
want to have on their boards rather than just sort of having a bunch of people of like mind. So when we start talking about diversity on boards, that what you're hinting at is there are other sorts of diversity other than
Mhm.
gender or background or those sorts of things in terms of expertise. I
Yeah.
think that's a super fair statement. So, um, and let's start with the boards that might be more attainable for those of the folks who are listening or watching. And so you can actually answer this question at any level you want, but let's sort of start um, at sort of I want to get on a board, or I'd like to move in the direction of being on a board, whether it's it may not be at those companies that everyone's heard of kinds of things, but like what should we be doing, or what should I be doing, anyone be doing to prepare themselves if that's part of their one of their goals.
Yeah. Well, I think the very first thing is it does. I think you have to ask the question, what is the landscape and how do I fit into it? That's a very fundamental question that I don't think people ask themselves enough, or with enough, sort of thoughtfulness. And in other words, what I'm saying is that a board is not a board is not a board. There's a saying that if you've seen one board, you've seen one board. And so people will sort of lump things together and say, well, start with nonprofit boards and then go to commercial boards, or but there's a bigger landscape even than that. So if you think about the commercial landscape, so there's nonprofit boards, there's the
Mhm.
commercial landscape, which in the context of where you would find somebody recruiting for board members, these would be in the case of public company, venture-backed companies, private equity-backed companies, ESOPs, which are employee stock-owned companies. I'm on the board of an ESOP. And then, as well as family offices, certain family office or certain family companies, like really, maybe big multi-generational family companies. And so, because all the rest of the landscape, any other board, like just a private company owned by a couple of people, they don't have to bring outside directors onto the board, right?
Right.
So so you have to ask your question, what is the landscape? Where do I fit? And where does my skill and my experience and my engagement with the world best fit? And that, you should ask that question whether you're in Nigeria or Canada or France or the US, or, what is the landscape? And, so I can tell you, let's just use the US as an example. The landscape is about 30,000. So you have more ESOPs, as an example, than you do public companies. But most people think about public companies because that's what's in the news, and that's what we know broadly, right?
Right. Right.
So, and then most people don't even know what an ESOP is. And, ESOPs tend to be construction companies, professional services companies, where you have someone built an empire, and now they want to sell it, and they want to sell it to their employees. So they do, and they do it through a vehicle like a 401k, and then you have a trustee. And I won't get into all of the details, but my main point is that, and we can talk about as much of this as you want. But my main point is, it just like a kid looking to go on to university, you ask yourself, what are the 10 I'm going to apply to? Right? And I'm not saying narrow it down to the 10 companies, but I'm saying figure out the ecosystem. There's universities, there's colleges, there's community colleges. We know this in education. You need to know this in the boardroom. And that's one of the biggest, best ways to prepare yourself, because then you start to realize how big the landscape is, much bigger than you thought it was. And you also start to realize that you have certain places where you should focus, and that leads you to how to build relationships.
So maybe I should have asked a different question earlier, right? I mean, at some level, the folks who are here are curious about this in some way, shape, or form, uh, and yet I should probably have you answer this question, which is, what are the benefits that we gain from
Mhm.
being on a board? Like what's in it for us, if you will, for being on a board, other than maybe prestige, which might be why people decide to listen. And this will be interesting. I'm curious. But beyond that, what are the benefits that we can personally gain from being
Yeah.
on board?
It's funny that you say that because I was just talking to somebody the other day and she said, I keep running to all these people who have, she didn't, these weren't her words, but they'll be mine, buyer's remorse. They jumped and joined boards and then they're like, why did I do this? And I think that's a fair question. So, why do you join boards? I mean, my very first experiences of a board was because I was one of three owners of the company. So, by definition, I ended up, sort of on the board,
Mhm.
by the way that our bylaws and our shareholder agreements were written. So, I didn't even think about it. Is this something I want to do? It's something that was part of my job,
Right,
right?
exactly.
So, nonprofit boards, certainly you do it because you want to, you know, make a difference in the world. And the big thing about nonprofit boards is that there is a give or a get. You're it's a very different thing than commercial boards because there isn't a there isn't a payoff for you other than, what you're doing to serve your soul, right? Because otherwise you're fundraising, you're putting in your own money, blood, sweat, and tears. But nonprofit boards are governed in the same in a very, very, very similar way to public company boards. So it's a great learning environment, where they have the kind of structure and rigor that public company boards have. And then if you're thinking about commercial boards, the reason to do it is a couple of different things. One is I've never met someone who said, I'm not a better executive for being on a board. Everyone becomes a better executive for serving on a board because you see the business in a very different way. When you're an executive in the organization, you're focused within the organization. You tend to have a tower that you own. When you're on a board, you get, first of all, you're in another company. So you see this sort of other perspective,
Right. Yep.
but you also see the whole perspective and you're dealing with things like CEO compensation and succession planning for the team and M&A and all these things that maybe you don't get as much exposure to in your day-to-day role as an executive. And so that's really meaningful. And I think also the other thing is as you become more senior in your career, you start to think about your skills and what you have to offer the world like a portfolio. The way we think about finances, we sort of start young career as I'm just saving for a house or a car and then you get to a place in your life where you're like, okay, I got to do the college tuition and the house and the this and this, and it's a portfolio, right? And same
Mhm.
thing in your senior career, you start to think, where else could I bring all my great talent? Could I serve on this board and that board? And you want to spread your talent. So that would be another really great way to think about why. And then the third is prestige and compensation, right? So some people do it just for the prestige, and that's never a reason to do it because it's a lot
There's
of
where the buyer's remorse comes in.
that's where the buyer's remorse comes in. Exactly. So if you serve on a private company board, venture backed, you're not going to get cash payment for that. You're going to get equity. And that may or may not become something. It could just be wallpaper, So if it doesn't become something, then it's it's you don't get a payout, right? Like so you're getting stock. In some other ones, some of private equity companies actually want you to invest back whatever you get.
Yeah.
Some companies do pay cash, but most of the private company scenarios, a lot of them don't pay cash. Public companies, they do pay cash, but they pay cash and equity, and you really need your cash to hold on to the equity because you can't really exercise it. You're not supposed to just cash it out right away. So
Right.
you have to hold on to it. You have to be able to pay the taxes on it. So people don't really think through that it takes a strategy to make it into something that is an economically viable option for you.
I want to go back to one of the first things you said about it making you a better executive. I can certainly say that for me. It gives you a chance to uh, see different businesses, see different situations, but it also helps you, at least I think it has for me, reflect on, okay, so I'm giving this counsel or this advice and how are we doing in that same area, right? So I think it can be really valuable in that regard. So one of the things that you said several times is you used the word ecosystem, but you
Mhm.
also started out early in sort of your origin story talking about sort of your network, right? This
Mhm.
sort of got you um, fully focused on boards. Um, what should we be doing? Okay, we've listened to you. We said, "Yep, these are benefits that I want. This is important to me. I want to make this one of my goals for whatever reasons." Right? You've talked about how to prepare ourselves in some ways, but certainly there's the preparing of a network as
Yes.
well. So, what's your advice around preparing our network as it relates to the goal of being on boards?
Yeah. That that's probably once you get past the do I have the experience and should that be in my, my future, and you get to this a bit of the you don't have to fully formed, but you get to the bit of the okay, and I get the landscape and I think I know where, then it really is about the network and your ability to position yourself. And so on the network side of things, I would absolutely say that it's true that the further you go up in an organization, the more your network matters. Whether it is for the next executive role or, to become a C suite, whatever, become a CEO, become an investor in the next great whatever. All of this is about your network. And it's very rarely about a recruiter and about someone finding you. It's about you being in the right place at the right time. And a lot of that is how you nurture and develop your network. So let's say, for example, that you have decided there's sort of four criteria that you want to think about. One is scale, another's industry, another's the financial model, and the other's business model. So financial model we've been talking about, is it public, private, is it venture
Right.
capital, private equity? Industry, we know what industry means. Business model, is it brick and mortar? Is it, SaaS? Is it an e-commerce business? Is it pharmaceuticals? Is it And then scale is how much scale have I seen? Because any board is looking for people who've seen the scale they're trying to get to. So if we're a $10 million company, we're trying to get to 100, we want people on our board who've seen 100.
Right.
So you kind of think about those things and you say, okay, so who, now I know, where I fit. Who do I talk to get to where I'm going? And so that's a lot, so if you say, well, gosh, venture capital backed companies or ESOPs make a lot of sense to me because Coco, spent 17 years in the professional services world. That makes a lot of sense to me. How do I find who's in that ecosystem? How do I build relationships with people who are in that ecosystem? And it's a lot of building new relationships. So our problem in networking is a couple of things. One is the language. We all imagine networking as being like in some room and we're standing as close to the cheese plate as we possibly can. And then we just chat with the other person next to the cheese plate and we exchange business cards and we feel good because we've handed out 7 of our business cards. But it's a horrible process and it's completely random, right? And it doesn't feel good to most of us. And or we think about networking as going to the people who know us best and saying, "Hey, I want to get a board seat. Will you keep me in mind?" And those are the two things you should not be doing, right? Because
Everything you know about this, don't do.
don't
Now,
do it.
now
Yeah.
Coco's going to tell you what to do.
Now I'll tell you what to do, right? So the reason I say that is because the people who are going to get you to where you're going are not the ones who already know you the best. They've already done as much as they can for you. And it's not the random people that you meet. What it is you have to think very strategically, do your research and say, who's in that ecosystem that I'm trying to get attached to? Who, can tell me more about X, Y, and Z? And then you do leverage one person to the next, and you get super curious about people. There's so much to say in this, but I think what I would say is go off and do your research about the strength of weak ties and the power of reciprocity. Those are really important sort of terms to understand in order to network well.
Perfect. So you're the perfect person for me to ask this question of, and that is, as you think about, as you've been working with and sort of thinking about boards of directors and that sort of work for a number of years, as you look forward, how would you say boards are changing and will change moving forward?
Boards are changing, and that is a fabulous thing for all of us who have, don't have the right networks to begin with. um, the ways in which boards are changing is increasingly you're seeing commercial boards look more and more like the C-suite, but at the next stage of the business. So sort of, you're getting more and more skill sets in go to market, so people who have marketing backgrounds and revenue backgrounds and product backgrounds and tech and cyber backgrounds and people, human capital backgrounds. There's more and more space for people with much more diverse backgrounds. International, I mean, we are becoming one global society, and there is a lot of question in the boardroom today around gig economy, global nomads, how to leverage, a global workforce, who to do business with, who not to do business with, how to understand your supply chains and how complex those are from a human rights perspective as well as resources. So boards are getting way more dynamic than they have ever been in the past. It used to be that boards focused very narrowly on a few things, CEO succession, performance, compensation, regulation and governance, and financial health. And now, with the pandemic, with George Floyd, with Roe v. Wade, with the war in Ukraine, you see boards getting together much more often. They're communicating with each other way more often than they ever did in the past. So all of this is really good for people who aspire to be on boards from all different sort of walks of life and different places in the organization. No, you don't need to be a CFO or a CEO to join boards. That's the great thing. And they're being held accountable to a lot more. They should have known, that they need to be in the know. They should have known they have to be guiding the business for the long term.
Right. So what didn't I've got 3 or 4 other questions after this. So I'm going to sort of shift gears. But before I do that, what didn't I ask that I should have? Or what didn't I ask that you wish I would have?
Oh, well, I mean, specific to boards, what I would say to everyone here, if you're sort of early in that journey and you're, saying to yourself, is this something I want in my career? Is this, I do think that it's very important to ask yourself that question, but also realize, our careers are more dynamic than they've ever been in the past. We're living longer. We don't want to retire like we used to. Retirement is not quite retirement, so people come in and out of it. And so I think serving on boards and being involved in the board ecosystem is a great path. I really think it's worth exploring. Don't stop in your career and think, well, I've come far as I can go in the corporate ladder, and now what's next for me is, volunteering and the golf course. No, that's not necessarily true. So to me, the best way to explore that is find your local venture ecosystem. Who's investing money in companies? What are their various different theses of investment? How could I be useful to those investment firms as an advisor? Make yourself an advisor, and then you get in as part of the ecosystem of potential board members. Volunteer your time, volunteer your energy. Be okay with that, because eventually then you can get paid for that.
All right. Awesome. So now I am going to shift gears. I got just a couple more questions for you. And one of them is this. So Coco, when you're not advising and helping people think about boards, what do you do for fun?
I am a constant crocheter.
And she has it right there, everybody.
I'm very fidgety. I'm a very fidgety person. So it helps me to have the crochet right here but I also know that requires looking down, and sometimes that bothers people. I also,
So you weren't doing that while I was introduced before I was
no,
introducing you? Okay.
no, I was not crocheting. No. I also am a potter. So I make pottery. I made this mug as an example.
I did not make this one.
And I am obsessed with my children. So I have a 21-year-old, an 18-year-old, and another 21-year-old who's pseudo adopted, think more kind of foster. and an ecosystem of kids around them that I'm obsessed with. So those are things I spend my time with.
And another thing that most people that are on this show spend some of their time doing is reading. So, what are you reading these days, Coco? The only thing you knew I was going to ask you, actually.
Yes. Well, one thing I read, and I highly recommend it to people who are thinking about a stepping stone into boards. Every couple of days, I get something called the wing briefing. I actually put it in the private chat uh, so that we could share it. But there's a guy named Rajiv Chand, and he creates the wing brief, and it's just a quick, like, here's what's going on in the tech world. So the tech world is kind of a lot of my background, because I've been in tech all my career. So he comes out and he says, here's what's going on, sort of the big news in the tech world, and then here's who's getting funded. And so I'm constantly learning about the new companies getting funding, and then I can go look and, well, who's backing them, and what's going on with this company. Was that one I would maybe want to attach myself to in some way? Now, for me, it's all about Athena and Athena Alliance, and bringing women to the boardroom and helping them prepare, and etc. So that's one of my tools in my toolkit that helps me know what's going on out in the world. But I highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in the tech world and learning more about venture capital and private equity as well.
Cool. So, I just put it up there. You mentioned Athena Alliance. So, where can people learn more? Where can they connect with you? How do you want people to connect with you, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, this would be actually, maybe this is the question I wish you'd asked, is way before you think about joining boards, you need to be preparing for boards in the way that there's three ways to get to the top. You either fund the business, you found the business, or you climb the ladder. So if you're climbing a ladder, there comes a point, like sort of around senior director, where you should start thinking like a funder and a founder, which means that you need to start looking around into the branches of the trees and understanding M&A and financials and legal acumen, etc. And that's one of the things Athena does. So I would love for you to join Athena earlier, before you start. Now I want to join a board. Join earlier. Learn about us. The website is in there, athenaalliance.com. And we're really, imagine if you had an evergreen MBA delivered Netflix style meets a very accretive LinkedIn that's not for sales and recruiting, but actually gets you where you're going.
There
That's
you go. AthenaAlliance.com. So, before we close up, I've got the question to ask all of you who are watching and listening. The question I ask every single episode, and it's 2 words. Now what? What are you going to do? Like, some people probably said this wasn't an episode for me and may not be hearing these words. But if you are still listening, something about this conversation intrigued you, and there's something that you heard that would be a next step for you. So the question would be, what is that step, and what action will you take? Because if you don't take any action, sort of, what's the point? You got the chance to be entertained, perhaps, but speaking of Netflix, you probably could have been better entertained. But if you really want to go beyond education to action, the question is, what did you get today that would make a difference for you in your goals as it relates to potentially being on boards of directors? So I hope that you'll take time to think about that and then take action on your thoughts. Coco, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. It was worth the wait to make this finally happen.
Appreciate being here. Thank you.
All right. And so, everybody, that concludes another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you found it helpful, I hope if this is your first episode, make sure you subscribe and like, and do all of those things. Send us a comment, all of that stuff. But you know what else you can do? You can tell a friend and have them join us, because every week we're back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.